The gate agent's voice cut through the terminal like a blade. Calm, polite, final. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to step aside. Those seats are no longer available to you." For half a second, the entire boarding area at gate C19 seemed to freeze. The low hum of conversations stalled. A rolling suitcase toppled onto its side somewhere behind them. The automated boarding chime kept repeating itself, cheerful and oblivious, announcing priority boarding for passengers who were already walking past Marcus Hale and his twin sister Renee without looking at them. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest before his mind could catch up. Renee felt it too. She could hear her own breathing suddenly loud in her ears, shallow and uneven, like she had just climbed a flight of stairs too fast. The words had been delivered with the same tone you'd use to apologize for a weather delay or a broken coffee machine. That was the part that made it worse. "Those seats," the agent repeated, tapping his screen with a manicured finger, "are being reassigned." The camera, if there had been one, would have started tight on Renee's face. 41 years old. Tired eyes that had learned to stay steady under pressure. A navy blazer, worn not for show, but for habit. Her lips pressed together, not in anger yet, but calculation. Then it would cut to Marcus. Same age, same bone structure, same controlled stillness. His jaw clenched just enough to show he was holding something back. They were not dressed like trouble. No raised voices, no entitled gestures. Two black professionals standing exactly where their boarding passes said they belonged, holding phones that displayed confirmed business class seats in crisp white letters against a blue background. Seats they had paid for weeks ago. Seats they had planned around because Renee's knee still ached when flights got long, and Marcus's blood pressure did not forgive overnight travel the way it used to. Behind the counter stood Evan Brooks, mid-50s, silver hair cropped close, posture relaxed in the way that came from 20 years of authority without challenge. Beside him hovered Lila Grant, late 20s, eyes flicking back and forth between the twins and the growing line of impatient passengers. Her hands kept smoothing the edges of a boarding pass stack that did not need smoothing. She hadn't spoken yet. She wouldn't, unless she had to. A man cleared his throat loudly from behind the counter. The sound carried. "Is there a problem here?" William Crowley had arrived without announcement, as men like him often did. 67 years old, thick ring on his left hand, the kind of watch that didn't need to announce its price. His grey overcoat hung open, confident. His eyes moved over Marcus and Renee quickly, efficiently, like items on a shelf that didn't belong in this aisle. Evan turned slightly toward him, lowering his voice just enough to signal respect. "We're handling a small seating adjustment, Mr. Crowley." Crowley smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I've been flying this route for years. I was assured the forward cabin would be appropriate." He didn't point. He didn't need to. His gaze had already done the work. Renee felt something tighten low in her stomach. Not shock, not disbelief. Recognition. She had seen this look in boardrooms, in donor meetings, in waiting rooms where her credentials were questioned twice, while others sailed through on a handshake. The look that said she was unexpected, out of place, temporary. Marcus spoke first. His voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "We're not adjusting anything. Those are our seats." Evan didn't look up. "I understand your frustration, sir. We're offering you compensation, a voucher. We just need you to cooperate so we can keep boarding on schedule." Cooperate. Renee almost laughed. She felt Lila's eyes flick toward her, then away. Lila's mouth opened, closed. She swallowed. A woman in line shifted her weight and sighed loudly. Someone else muttered about tight connections. The social pressure began to press in, invisible but heavy, the unspoken suggestion that making a scene would make everything worse. Renee inhaled slowly. She could smell the coffee from the kiosk nearby, burnt and sour. She could hear the distant echo of another gate announcing final boarding. She could feel the faint tremor in her knee that always came when her body sensed a fight before her mind accepted it. "We're not refusing to board," she said calmly. "We're refusing to give up seats we paid for." Evan finally looked up. His smile thinned. "Ma'am, this is a discretionary decision. If you don't comply, I may have to escalate." There it was, the word that changed the temperature in the room. Escalate. Marcus exhaled through his nose. He pulled his phone closer to his chest, thumb hovering over the screen. He wasn't calling yet, not because he was unsure, because he was choosing the moment. Crowley checked his watch, exaggerated the gesture. "I really don't have time for this," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Some people don't understand how these cabins work." Renee turned her head slowly, met his eyes. Her gaze was calm, assessing. "Some people," she said, "understand exactly how they work." For a split second, something flickered across Crowley's face. Surprise, then annoyance, then dismissal. Lila shifted again. Her fingers tightened around the boarding passes. She leaned toward Evan, whispering something Renee couldn't hear. Evan's jaw tightened. He shook his head once, a small movement, final. Marcus tapped his screen. The call connected. "Hi," he said into the phone, voice low, controlled. "Yes, I need to report an issue at gate C19. We're being asked to give up confirmed business class seats for another passenger." He paused, listening. "Yes, that's correct. No operational change, no mechanical issue, just a request." Another pause. His eyes never left Evan's face. "Yes, we are both on the line." The air shifted. Evan straightened. Lila went pale. Crowley's smile vanished completely. Marcus listened, then nodded slowly. "Thank you. We'll wait." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. No one spoke for a moment. The boarding chime rang again, louder now, more insistent. Renee felt it then. Not fear, not anger, something deeper. The quiet certainty that this moment was already bigger than the flight, bigger than the seats, bigger than the man standing in front of them pretending this was routine. Because Evan didn't know who they were. Crowley didn't know either. And Lila, standing there with her hands shaking, had no idea that the call Marcus had just made did not go to customer service. It went higher. Much higher. The silence that followed felt heavier than the crowd itself. It pressed against the glass walls of the terminal, against the polished floor, against Evan Brooks's practiced calm. He adjusted his jacket, a subtle movement meant to reassert control, but his eyes betrayed him. They kept drifting back to Marcus's phone, as if it might ring again on its own. Lila Grant stood rigid beside him. Her shoulders were tight, her chin slightly lifted, in a posture she had learned was safer than looking uncertain. Inside, her pulse was racing. She had heard the tone in Marcus's voice. Not loud, not threatening. Confident. The kind of confidence that did not ask for permission. The kind that came from knowing something others did not. William Crowley leaned closer to the counter, lowering his voice, but not enough. "This is unnecessary," he said. "I was told my needs would be accommodated." He said needs the way other people said rights. Evan nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. We're just clarifying a few details." Renee watched the exchange with a stillness that came from long practice. She noticed the way Evan avoided looking at her directly now, the way his earlier ease had drained into irritation. She noticed Lila's fingers trembling as she pretended to check the system again. Renee wondered how many times Lila had stood in this exact position, watching something wrong unfold and telling herself it was not her place to stop it. Behind them, The line shifted. A man in a windbreaker leaned out to see what was happening. An older woman clutched her purse tighter, eyes narrowed, not unkind, but wary. No one said anything. Most people didn't. That was how these moments survived. They fed on silence. "Let's be clear," Evan said finally, his voice gaining a sharper edge. "If you refuse this accommodation, you may be denied boarding. I don't want that to happen." Marcus tilted his head slightly. A small gesture. Curious. Almost sympathetic. Neither do we. Renee felt the weight of every year she had spent learning how to stay composed when someone else decided she was inconvenient. She thought of the early days in her career, when speaking up meant being labeled difficult. She thought of how many times she had swallowed words to keep the peace. She did not swallow them now. "You're asking us to move because he asked," she said, nodding once toward Crowley. "Say it plainly." Crowley bristled. "That's not what I said." "But it is what you meant," Renee replied. Her voice was even. That was the dangerous part. Evan's radio crackled softly at his hip. He ignored it. "Ma'am, this conversation isn't productive." Marcus took a step forward. Not aggressive, just close enough that Evan could no longer pretend this was abstract. "Then let's end it," he said. "We'll board in the seats we paid for." Evan opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted him. Heavy shoes, measured pace. The kinds that belonged to someone who had no reason to hurry. Security arrived not with urgency, but with inevitability. Officer Daniel Ortiz was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, expression unreadable. Years in uniform had taught him how to read a room before anyone spoke. His partner, a younger man with nervous energy, hovered half a step behind him. "What's going on?" Ortiz asked. Evan spoke immediately, too quickly. "We have passengers refusing a seating reassignment and delaying boarding." Ortiz looked at Marcus and Renee. He noticed their posture, their stillness, their eyes. He had seen anger. He had seen entitlement. This was neither. Renee met his gaze. "We have confirmed seats. We're being asked to give them up for another passenger." Ortiz turned to Evan. "Is there an operational issue?" Evan hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Long enough. "No," he said. "It's a customer service decision." Ortiz nodded slowly. "Based on what?" Crowley stepped forward. "Based on my status," he said, unable to stop himself. "I fly this airline every month." The words hung in the air. Naked now. Undeniable. Ortiz's eyes flicked to Crowley, then back to Evan. "That's not a policy," he said flatly. Evan's jaw tightened. "We're allowed discretion." "Discretion isn't discrimination," Ortiz replied. Lila inhaled sharply. The word landed like a blow. She felt heat rush to her face. She had thought it without naming it. Hearing it spoken out loud made it real. Marcus's phone vibrated once in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. He could feel the shift happening. Slow, reluctant, but irreversible. Ortiz turned to Marcus and Renee. "Do you want to board?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Then board," Ortiz said. He looked back at Evan. "Let them through." Evan stared at him. For a moment, the mask cracked. "You can't override." "I can," Ortiz said quietly. "And I am." Crowley's face flushed. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I'll be filing a complaint." Ortiz didn't blink. "You're free to." Renee felt something loosen in her chest as she and Marcus stepped past the counter. The jet bridge yawned open in front of them, the narrow hallway humming softly. As they walked, she could feel eyes on her back, some curious, some uncomfortable, some resentful. Inside the aircraft, the cabin lights glowed warm. Leather seats, soft murmurs. A flight attendant paused mid-step, eyebrows lifting slightly as she registered the tension clinging to them. "Welcome aboard," she said carefully. Marcus nodded. Renee smiled faintly. They took their seats, the ones printed on their boarding passes, the ones Evan had tried to erase with a few taps of a keyboard. Crowley passed them moments later, jaw clenched, eyes forward. He did not look at them. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Renee rested her head against the seat for a moment. Her heart was still racing, her hands still cold. "You okay?" Marcus asked quietly. She nodded. "I will be." He watched her, then looked out the window as the terminal slid away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone at last. The screen lit up with a single missed call and a message beneath it. "Call me when you're seated." He didn't smile. Not yet. Because he knew something Evan Brooks did not. Something Crowley would never imagine. Something Lila Grant was about to learn the hard way. The call Marcus had placed had not ended the story. It had started it. The cabin settled into its rhythm, the low mechanical whir of systems coming alive beneath the floor. Seatbelts clicked. Overhead bins thudded shut. The ordinary sounds of departure wrapped themselves around the extraordinary tension that refused to dissipate. Renee stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. Her reflection stared back from the darkened window, doubled, older somehow. Marcus could see it without looking. He could always tell when she was replaying a moment, dissecting it piece by piece, cataloguing what had been said and what had been implied. He had learned long ago not to interrupt her when she did that. Across the aisle, a man folded a newspaper with deliberate care. 2 rows up, someone cleared their throat too loudly. The cabin was full of people pretending nothing unusual had happened, which, in its own way, felt like an accusation. The lead flight attendant moved down the aisle with practiced calm. Her name tag read Susan Keller, late 50s, grey hair pulled back neatly. The kind of woman who had been flying since before deregulation, since before carry-on fees and online check-in, and the quiet erosion of courtesy. She stopped beside Marcus and Renee's row, just long enough. "I heard there was some confusion at the gate," she said softly, not quite a question. Renee met her eyes. There was. Susan nodded once, not surprised. "If you need anything, let me know." It wasn't a promise of protection. It was something older. Recognition. As she moved on, Marcus finally unlocked his phone. The message glowed on the screen, stark and brief. "I'm aware. Stay where you are. Don't engage further." No name, no explanation. Just certainty. Renee noticed his stillness. "That who I think it is?" He nodded. "Yeah." She exhaled slowly. "So it's real." "It's real," he said. But there was no triumph in his voice. Only weight. The plane began its taxi. Outside, the terminal lights slid past, then receded. Marcus watched the ground crew in reflective vests, the choreography of departure so precise it bordered on ritual. He wondered how many of them had watched what happened at gate C-19. How many had noticed? How many had looked away? Behind them, William Crowley pressed the call button. Susan appeared again, her smile polite but guarded. "Yes, sir?" "I want to lodge a formal complaint," Crowley said, his voice pitched to carry. "I was publicly embarrassed at the gate." Susan's eyes flicked briefly toward Marcus and Renee, then back. "About what, sir?" "I was denied appropriate accommodations," Crowley said, "because of a security officer overstepping his authority." Susan held his gaze. "I'll note your concern," she said, "and pass it along through the proper channels." Crowley frowned. "I expect follow-up." "So does everyone," Susan replied evenly, and moved on. Marcus felt Renee's knee bounce once, twice,
before she forced it still. "He really believes that," she murmured, "that he was wronged." Marcus didn't answer. He was listening to the quiet vibration of his phone against his palm. Another message arrived. They pulled the recording. "Not just your call." He closed his eyes briefly. At 35,000 feet, the illusion of distance set in, as if altitude might separate actions from consequences.
As if what happened on the ground could be left behind with the jet bridge and the gate and the man who thought discretion belonged to him alone. Renee leaned back, closing her eyes. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "I hate this part," she said quietly. "What part?" "The waiting. Knowing something's coming but not knowing how bad it'll be." Marcus studied her profile. The faint crease between her brows. The scar near her hairline from when they were kids, riding bikes too fast downhill. He had always been the one to jump first. She had always been the one to calculate the landing. "It won't be clean," he said. "It never is." She nodded. "I don't want him fired just to make a point." "I know. I want him stopped," she said. "There's a difference." Marcus swallowed. That difference was the reason he had made the call he did, instead of walking away. The reason he had listened to his instincts, instead of the voice that said, "Don't escalate, don't make trouble, don't be that person." The seatbelt sign chimed off. Movement rippled through the cabin. Laptops emerged, drinks were poured. Life resumed. But below the surface, something had already fractured. 3 states away, in a glass-walled office overlooking a grey river, the call log from gate C19 was being reviewed for the 3rd time. The audio wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no slurs, just a measured voice asking a question that should never have needed asking, and another voice explaining, calmly, why some passengers mattered more than others. The problem wasn't that the words were extreme. The problem was how ordinary they sounded. A man with thinning hair leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had seen versions of this before. Complaints filed, apologies issued, training mandated. Time passed, patterns continued. This time, there was a wrinkle. The call had come through a channel few passengers even knew existed. A channel designed not for customer satisfaction, but for risk, legal exposure, brand liability. He picked up his phone. "Get me the full employment record for Evan Brooks," he said. "Every write-up, every note, every complaint that didn't go anywhere." He paused, listening. "And I want the staffing logs for that gate. Today, last month, last year." Another pause. "Yes, include the contractors." Back on the plane, Renee watched the clouds drift past, brilliant and indifferent. "Do you ever think about how close we came to just letting it go?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "All the time. And how many times before this we probably did." He didn't answer that one. Some truths didn't need voice. Crowley passed their row on his way to the restroom, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed ahead. For a moment, Renee wondered if he felt anything at all. Regret, doubt, or just irritation at a system that hadn't bent quickly enough. When he returned to his seat, he opened his laptop and began typing furiously. Emails, perhaps, complaints, explanations that cast him as the aggrieved party. Marcus watched him for a second longer than necessary, then looked away. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth, reassuring. Estimated arrival time, weather conditions. Routine words layered over an extraordinary truth. Somewhere, right now, decisions were being made that would ripple outward. Quietly, methodically. Renee felt Marcus's hand rest briefly on her arm. Grounding, present. "No matter what happens," he said softly. "We didn't imagine it." She nodded. "That matters." It mattered because too many stories ended with doubt, with people questioning their own perception, their own worth. with injustice dissolving into ambiguity. This one would not dissolve. As the plane began its descent, Marcus's phone vibrated again. "Stand by. This will move faster than usual." He locked the screen and slipped the phone away. Below them, the city spread out, grid and river and steel. Somewhere within it, Evan Brooks was finishing his shift, unaware that the quiet authority he had wielded for years was already being dismantled. Lila Grant was likely replaying the moment she chose silence, wondering if it would cost her more than she had ever imagined. And Marcus and Renee, seated in the cabin they had fought to keep, felt the story accelerating towards something none of them could stop. Not yet, but soon. The plane touched down with a muted thud, tires screaming briefly against the runway before surrendering to friction and routine. Applause rippled weakly through the cabin, the kind that came more from habit than relief. Marcus felt the jolt travel up his spine. Renee's eyes opened immediately. She was alert again. Too alert. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, phones came back to life one by one. Screens lit up. Notifications stacked. The world rushed back in. Marcus didn't check his yet. He waited. He had learned the value of timing from a man who never raised his voice and never explained himself twice. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, movement exploded. People stood too quickly, yanked bags from overhead bins, apologized without meaning it. William Crowley was already on his feet, elbowing forward with the urgency of someone who believed delays were insults personally directed at him. Renee stayed seated. She watched him go. His shoulders were rigid now, the confidence replaced by something brittle. He did not look back. Susan Keller appeared again, this time without the professional distance. "If you're able," she said quietly, "the captain would like to speak with you before you leave the aircraft." Renee felt her pulse spike. Is something wrong? Susan shook her head. "No, but something's moving." They waited until the cabin emptied. The quiet afterward felt cavernous. Empty seats, crumpled napkins, the faint smell of reheated coffee. Susan led them forward, past the cockpit door, into a small crew room just off the jet bridge. Captain Howard Bennett stood as they entered. Early 60s, broad frame softened by age. His uniform jacket hung neatly, but his expression was stripped of ceremony. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Hale." His voice was steady. "Thank you for waiting." He didn't offer apologies first. He offered respect. "I was briefed on what happened at your departure gate," he continued. "I've flown for this airline for 32 years. I've seen policy bent. I've seen discretion abused. What I heard today crossed a line." Renee studied his face. She saw anger there, not performative, personal. "I filed a report before we landed," Bennett said. "So did my first officer. Not because of the seating issue, because of the reasoning behind it." Marcus finally took out his phone. 3 missed calls, all from the same blocked number. 1 voicemail. He didn't play it yet. "We don't want special treatment," Renee said carefully. "We just wanted to fly without being treated like a problem." Bennett nodded. "That's exactly what concerned me." There was a knock at the door. A man in a charcoal suit stepped inside without waiting for permission. He looked out of place among uniforms and safety placards. Early 50s, crisp haircut, eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Thomas Keene," he said. "Corporate compliance." Renee's breath caught. Not because of the title, because of the timing. Keene glanced at Marcus, then at Renee. "You made a call from gate C-19. Marcus met his gaze. "Yes." "You didn't go through customer service?" "No." Keene nodded once. "Good." He turned slightly, angling his body away from the captain. "We've been tracking that gate for over a year." The words landed softly. He let them sit. "Multiple complaints," Keene continued. all categorized as misunderstandings. None escalated. Until today. Renee felt a slow chill creep up her spine. So you knew? We suspected, Keene corrected. Suspicion doesn't hold up in court. Marcus's phone vibrated again. He checked it this time. A single line of text. Proceed. Keene noticed the movement. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your call was recorded, he said. So was the internal channel that followed. Mr. Brooks used language that created liability. Renee frowned. Brooks? The gate supervisor, Keene said. Evan Brooks. Captain Bennett exhaled sharply. I knew it. Keene continued. What matters is not one decision. It's pattern. And today, for the first time, we have enough. Renee folded her arms, grounding herself. What happens now? Keene didn't answer immediately. He looked tired, not sympathetic, resolute. Now, he said, everyone who touched that decision is frozen in place. No schedule changes, no quiet transfers, no early retirements. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Everyone? Keene met his eyes. Everyone. There it was. The line they had crossed simply by refusing to move. Keene turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Mr. Crowley has already filed a complaint. Renee almost smiled. Almost. And? Marcus asked. And it's being added to the file, Keene said, as corroboration. When the door closed behind him, the room felt smaller, heavier. Captain Bennett leaned against the counter. I don't know how this will end, he said honestly, but I know it won't be buried. Renee nodded slowly. That's enough. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Renee felt the delayed tremor in her legs, the body catching up to the moment. Marcus steadied her without comment. Down the corridor, William Crowley stood near the exit, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp, animated. He stopped when he saw them. His eyes flicked from Marcus to Renee, searching for something. Control, confirmation, superiority. He found none. Marcus passed him without a word. Renee did the same. Behind them, unseen but already in motion, files were opening. Emails were being forwarded. Conversations were being replayed by people paid to notice what others ignored. The story had left the gate. It was inside the system now. The call came just after 7 in the evening, when Evan Brooks was halfway through reheating leftovers and convincing himself the day hadn't been as bad as it felt. The microwave hummed. The apartment was quiet, except for the neighbor's television bleeding through the wall. He checked the caller ID and frowned. Restricted. He answered anyway. This is Evan. Mr. Brooks, a man's voice said, calm, flat. This is Thomas Keene with Corporate Compliance. I need you to sit down. Evan laughed once, sharp and defensive. If this is about that situation at C-19, it was handled. The passengers boarded. There was a pause. Not a delay, a decision. It wasn't handled, Keene said. It was documented. Evan felt the temperature in the room change. I followed protocol. You followed habit, Keene replied. Those are not the same thing. The microwave beeped. Evan didn't move to stop it. You're blowing this out of proportion. Keene exhaled slowly, as if choosing patience. Do you recall a complaint filed last March? Business class passenger questioned. Same gate. Evan's throat tightened. That was different. And the one in September? Keene continued. Similar language, similar rationale. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. He walked to the counter and leaned on it, suddenly aware of the way his knees felt unsteady. You've been placed on administrative leave, Keene said, effective immediately. That's not... Evan stopped himself, changed tactics. You can't do that without a review. This is the review, Keane replied. There will be more. The line went dead. Evans stared at his phone long after the call ended. The microwave beeped again. He turned it off without opening the door. The food inside could wait. Everything could wait. He sank into a chair and rubbed his face with both hands, trying to reconstruct the day in a way that didn't end like this. Across town, Lila Grant sat on the edge of her bed, still in uniform, shoes kicked off but untouched. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. She answered on the third ring. Hello? Ms. Grant, a woman's voice said. This is Human Resources. We need to speak with you first thing tomorrow morning. Lila swallowed. About what? Your role at gate C19 today. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had told herself she was safe. She hadn't said anything wrong. She hadn't made the call. She had followed instructions. That was how it worked. That was how you survived. I just did what I was told, Lila said quickly. There was a pause. Then, we'll discuss that tomorrow. The call ended. Lila stared at the blank screen. For the first time since the gate, her hands began to shake. In a quiet office overlooking the city, Thomas Keane stood at a window and watched traffic crawl below. He held his phone loosely now, the hard part done. The easy part would come later, when people pretended this was sudden, unexpected, unavoidable. His assistant hovered nearby. They're asking how far this goes. Keane didn't turn. As far as it needs to. And the twins? She asked. Keane's mouth tightened. They're not the story. They're the trigger. At a hotel downtown, Marcus and Renee sat in separate armchairs, shoes off, jackets draped over the backs. The adrenaline had finally drained, leaving a heavy quiet in its wake. The city outside glowed amber through the window. Renee broke the silence first. Do you ever feel guilty when it works? Marcus considered the question. I feel worse when it doesn't. She nodded. I keep thinking about her. The girl at the counter. Lila, Marcus said. Renee looked at him. You noticed? I notice systems, he replied. They're made of people. Renee leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I don't want her crushed for someone else's pattern. Marcus didn't answer right away. Patterns crush people, he said finally. Stopping them does too. There's no clean version. Renee closed her eyes. She knew that. She had lived long enough to know that justice was rarely gentle. Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, the number wasn't blocked. He answered without hesitation. Yes. The voice on the other end was older, controlled, familiar in a way that made his spine straighten. It's done, the voice said. The supervisor is out. His manager is next. Marcus exhaled slowly. And the rest? Under review, the voice replied. But this won't be contained. Renee watched Marcus as he listened. She could see it in his posture, the weight shifting, the moment becoming something else. He ended the call and sat quietly for a beat. Then he looked at her. They're firing the team. Renee absorbed that. Not shock, not relief, just gravity. All of them. The ones who touched it, enabled it, covered it. She nodded. And the man who wanted the seat. Marcus's jaw tightened. His loyalty status is being suspended pending review. Renee almost laughed, but it came out as a breath instead. He's going to lose his mind. Marcus looked toward the window again. He already thinks he has. Somewhere across town, William Crowley paced his living room, phone pressed to his ear, voice rising with each sentence. He spoke of humiliation, of disrespect, of precedent. He spoke as if volume could restore order. On the other end of the line, a junior executive listened silently and took notes. Not because the complaint mattered, because it completed the picture. By morning, the emails would go out, carefully worded, legally vetted, words like conduct, review, separation. No drama, no names in public. But inside the company, the message would be unmistakable. This time, it stuck. Renee stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the glass. The city felt different now. Not kinder, not safer, just altered. "We didn't plan this," she said. Marcus joined her. "No. But it happened," she continued, "because we didn't move." Marcus nodded once. "Because we stayed." Outside, traffic flowed. People hurried. Somewhere, careers were ending. Somewhere else, policies were being rewritten by people who had sworn they already were. The story had crossed the point of no return, and none of them could pretend otherwise. Morning came without ceremony. No sunrise revelation, no cleansing quiet. Just emails, notifications, and the low-grade hum of consequences moving through a system that preferred things hidden. Marcus woke before his alarm. He lay still, listening to the city through the hotel window. Sirens somewhere far off. A delivery truck backing up, its warning beep echoing between buildings. Renee was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed in yesterday's clothes, scrolling through her phone with a focus that made her shoulders tense. "They're moving fast," she said, without looking up. Marcus pushed himself upright. "Fast isn't the same as right." "No," she said, "but it's not nothing." She turned the screen toward him. An internal memo had leaked overnight, not to the press, not yet, but to the employees. Language careful, bloodless. Administrative leave, pending investigation, temporary reassignment. Words designed to sound calm while the ground shifted underneath them. At headquarters, the mood was anything but calm. Thomas Keane moved through the compliance floor like a storm with a suit on. Doors opened before he reached them. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. He carried no files. He didn't need to. Everything he needed was already pulled, indexed, cross-referenced. Patterns rarely hid once you knew where to look. In a conference room with frosted glass walls, 6 managers sat in silence. Evan Brooks's chair was empty. So was his manager's. Their absence spoke louder than any reprimand. Keane placed a tablet on the table and activated the screen. Audio filled the room. Marcus's voice. Calm. Precise. Asking a question that forced an answer no one wanted recorded. Then Evan's voice. Measured. Confident. Explaining discretion as if it were policy. Keane let the recording play to the end. He didn't interrupt it. He didn't soften it. "This," he said when it stopped, "is not an incident. It's evidence." A woman at the table cleared her throat. "We've handled similar complaints before." Keane looked at her. "That's the problem." Another manager shifted in his seat. "If we make this public..." "We didn't make it public," Keane cut in. "It made itself public the moment it was recorded." The room went still. "What's your recommendation?" someone asked. Keane didn't hesitate. Terminate the supervisor. Terminate the manager who buried the complaints. Suspend the supporting staff pending review. Revoke customer privileges for the passenger who initiated the request. And audit every gate on this route going back 5 years. The silence that followed was heavy. Not because they disagreed, because they understood the cost. Down the hall, a junior analyst watched Keane through the glass and felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. Not because she believed the company was suddenly just, but because for the first time, she saw consequences travel upward instead of disappearing sideways. At the hotel, Renee sat with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. "I keep thinking about Lila," she said.
About what happens to people who don't start it, but don't stop it either. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples. Systems survive on that space. Do we? She asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He checked his phone. The blocked number had texted again. Briefing in 2 hours. Be available.
Renee watched his face.
You're not telling me something. He met her eyes. I'm not telling you everything. She nodded. That was fair. It always had been. Across town, Lila Grant sat in a windowless office, hands folded in her lap, staring at a framed poster about customer care. The HR representative across from her spoke gently, carefully. Words like opportunity and development and expectations floated through the air, barely landing. Did you believe the request was inappropriate? The representative asked. Lila swallowed. Her instinct was to hedge, to soften, to protect. But something had cracked overnight. She thought of Marcus's voice, of Renee's eyes, of the way Evan had shaken his head when she whispered that this felt wrong. Yes, she said. The room went quiet. Why didn't you intervene? The representative asked. Lila closed her eyes for a moment. Because I was afraid, she said. And because I've seen what happens to people who speak up. The representative nodded slowly.
Not surprised. That will be noted.
What happens to me? Lila asked. The answer was honest. I don't know yet. At the airport, gate C19 was closed. A temporary sign redirected passengers to adjacent gates. Maintenance crews moved in and out, checking cables, replacing hardware that had worked just fine the day before. Sometimes, systems disguised accountability as upgrades. William Crowley sat at his dining table, newspaper spread out, untouched. His phone buzzed again. Another email. Polite, firm, informing him that his preferred status was under review, pending investigation into conduct that violated company values. He scoffed aloud. Values, he muttered. He began drafting a response, then stopped, deleted it, started again. The words came out sharper each time. He hit send on the 5th version, convinced volume would win where logic had failed. At noon, the press caught a scent. Not the story, not yet, but the movement. A reporter noticed the staffing changes. Another noticed the sudden audit language in an internal memo that wasn't meant to be public. By early afternoon, phones were ringing. Keane stood in a smaller office now, phone to his ear. No comment, he said again. No comment. No comment. He hung up and turned to his assistant. Loop in legal. They already are, she said. And communications. Keane nodded. Good. Keep them out of this room. At the hotel, Marcus finally checked his voicemail. The voice was older, calm, controlled, the kind that didn't waste words. You didn't do this for attention. I respect that. But attention is coming anyway. Be ready. Marcus deleted the message. Renee watched him. Is this where it gets ugly? He considered it. This is where it gets honest. 2 hours later, the call came. Not from compliance, not from legal, not from customer service. The name on the screen made Marcus straighten instinctively. Renee saw it. Her breath caught. He didn't answer immediately. He waited until the second ring. Yes, he said. The voice on the other end was steady, measured. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but careful enough to sound reasonable. Mr. Hale, this is David Klein. Marcus said nothing. I understand you had an experience yesterday that fell short of our standards, Klein continued. I'd like to speak with you directly. Renee leaned forward, every muscle alert. Marcus's voice was calm. About what? There was a pause, a recalibration. About what happens next, Klein said. Marcus closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in relief, in recognition. The ceiling above him didn't change, the room didn't darken, no music swelled, but the story shifted all the same. Because when the call comes from that high, it means the ground beneath everyone else has already started to move. And somewhere, behind layers of assistance and glass and policy language, the CEO was finally paying attention. Marcus didn't answer right away.
He let the silence stretch, just long enough to remind the man on the other end that this was not a favor being granted. This was a reckoning arriving late. David Klein waited. CEOs learned patience early. It was how they survived rooms where everyone else spoke first. "I'm listening," Marcus said at last. Klein's voice remained smooth, but something beneath it tightened. "I want to be clear. This call is not about damage control. It's about understanding." Renee leaned closer, close enough to hear the faint hiss of the line. She could picture Klein without seeing him. Mid-60s, carefully chosen words. A man who had spent decades believing systems worked because he told himself they did. "Understanding usually comes before accountability," Marcus said, "not after." Another pause, longer this time. "You're right," Klein said. "And that's on us." Us. Renee noticed that. Not him, not them. Us. The language of shared responsibility, adopted only when isolation became dangerous. Klein continued. "I've reviewed the recordings, all of them. I've read the internal summaries. I've spoken with compliance. What happened at that gate wasn't a mistake." "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't." "It was allowed," Klein agreed. Renee felt the weight of that word settle into the room. Allowed. Not caused, not initiated. Allowed. A quiet admission that cut deeper than an apology ever could. Klein cleared his throat. "I won't insult you with platitudes. You didn't call for sympathy. You called because you knew where the pressure points were." Marcus said nothing. "That tells me you've seen this before," Klein said. "Not just as a passenger." Renee closed her eyes briefly. The camera would linger here if this were a film, on the stillness, on the held breath. Marcus answered evenly. "I've seen how systems protect themselves. I've seen how language gets used to excuse behavior instead of stopping it." Klein exhaled. "Then you know this isn't just about one gate." "Yes," Marcus said. "And you know it never was." Across the city, in a conference room with no windows, Thomas Keene stood with his arms crossed as legal counsel argued quietly over phrasing. Words like exposure and precedent floated through the air. Keene didn't interrupt. He was waiting for something else. His phone buzzed once. A single word appeared on the screen. Engaged. Keene nodded to himself. The moment had arrived. Once the CEO engaged directly, containment was no longer possible. The system had to decide what it valued more, stability or truth. Back at the hotel, Renee watched Marcus's face as he listened. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not fear, strategy. "What do you want?" Klein asked finally. The question hung there, deceptively simple. Marcus glanced at Renee. She gave a small nod. Not permission. Alignment. "I want you to stop treating this like a public relations issue," Marcus said, "and start treating it like an ethical failure." Klein absorbed that. "Those aren't mutually exclusive. They are when one is used to avoid the other," Marcus replied. Another silence. Somewhere, papers shifted. A chair creaked. Renee imagined Klein in his office, skyline behind him, fingers steepled, wondering how much truth the market could tolerate. I can't undo what happened, Klein said, but I can decide what happens because of it. That's always been true, Marcus said. The difference is whether you will. Klein's voice dropped slightly, less rehearsed now. If I do this the way you're suggesting, people will lose jobs. Marcus didn't flinch. They already have, he said, just not the ones who deserved to. Renee felt a chill. She knew this line. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a blade. Klein exhaled slowly. You're asking me to tear into my own infrastructure. Marcus's tone softened, just a fraction. I'm asking you to look at it. There it was, the moment when power met mirror. Across town, Lila Grant stepped out of the HR office into a hallway that felt suddenly unfamiliar. She leaned against the wall, breathing through the tightness in her chest. She didn't know if she would keep her job. She didn't know if telling the truth would save her or cost her everything. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Silence had not protected her. At the same time, William Crowley sat in his home office, scrolling through an email thread that had stopped responding. No acknowledgements, no reassurances, just corporate language that felt colder with every reread. He slammed his laptop shut, then opened it again. Typed, deleted, typed again. For the first time in a very long time, his influence felt negotiable. Back on the call, Klein spoke again. There are people beneath me who will fight this. Marcus nodded, even though Klein couldn't see it. There always are. And above me, Klein added quietly. Investors, board members, people who don't like disruption. Renee felt Marcus's shoulder shift. He straightened slightly, as if aligning himself with something taller than the room. Disruption isn't what scares them, Marcus said. Exposure is. Klein was silent. Renee leaned forward, her voice entering the call for the first time. You didn't call us to ask what we want, she said calmly. You called because you realized this won't stop with us. Klein paused, then carefully. That's correct. Good, Renee said. Then let's stop pretending this is about us. The line hummed softly. Somewhere, a clock ticked. You should know, Klein said at last, that I grew up believing this company stood for fairness. That's not marketing. That's personal. Marcus replied evenly. Belief isn't protection. Klein let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but wasn't. No, it isn't. Another voice entered the call without warning. Lower, sharper. David, legal is on standby. Renee's eyes widened slightly. Marcus recognized the tactic immediately. Pressure, time, containment. Give me 5 minutes, Klein said. The line clicked. Silence returned. Marcus lowered the phone slowly. His hands were steady, but Renee could see the strain in his eyes now. Not fear, responsibility. They're going to make an example, she said. Yes, he replied. The question is, of whom? She searched his face. Are we ready for that? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked down at the street below. People moved in patterns. Traffic obeyed lights. Systems worked because people followed rules they didn't always believe in. I didn't make that call to be brave, he said quietly. I made it because I was tired. Renee joined him. So am I. The phone rang again. Same number. Marcus answered. I have to make a decision, Klein said. And once I do, it won't be reversible. Marcus's voice was calm, controlled, unyielding. Neither was what happened at that gate. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was resolve, forming. And somewhere deep inside the company, beyond memos and meetings, and carefully crafted statements, the ground began to shift in a way that would not settle back into place. Not this time. The decision landed quietly, not with an announcement, not with a statement, just a shift in tone that people who had worked inside large institutions learned to recognize the way sailors recognized a change in wind. At headquarters, the executive floor locked down for an emergency session. Assistants rerouted calls without explanation. Calendars emptied themselves. The boardroom lights came on long before sunset. David Klein sat at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He hadn't done that in years. Around him, faces arranged themselves into practiced neutrality. Legal, operations, human resources, communications. People who knew how to survive storms by becoming furniture. Thomas Keene stood against the wall, tablet in hand, silent by design. Klein didn't open with pleasantries. "We are not here to discuss optics," he said. "We are here to discuss failure." That word landed hard. A senior vice president cleared her throat. "David, with respect, we don't yet have—" "We have recordings," Klein interrupted. "We have documented patterns. We have internal complaints that were categorized, buried, and ignored. That is not ambiguity. That is negligence." No one argued. Not because they agreed, because they knew when argument would be remembered. Klein gestured to Keene. "Walk them through it." Keene stepped forward. His voice was precise, almost clinical. "Gate C-19 has generated 7 formal complaints in the last 22 months related to discretionary seating enforcement. All were downgraded. All involved passengers of color. The supervisor involved handled or influenced every resolution." A murmur moved around the table, controlled, contained, but present. "And today?" Klein asked. "Today," Keene said, "we have audio evidence of discriminatory rationale. We have corroboration from security. We have a recorded escalation that bypassed customer service and entered compliance risk channels." Someone finally said it. The twins. Keene nodded once. "Yes." Klein leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused. He wasn't seeing the room anymore. He was seeing the system as it actually was, stripped of intention and narrative. A machine that did exactly what it had been allowed to do. "We can contain this," the head of communications said carefully. "Issue a statement. Acknowledge concerns. Commit to training." Klein turned toward her. "That's what we did last time." She hesitated. "That was different." "No," Klein said quietly. "It wasn't." Silence followed. Not the polite kind. The dangerous kind. "I'm not interested in another apology cycle," Klein continued. "I'm interested in stopping this from happening again." A man near the far end of the table leaned forward. "That requires accountability." "Yes," Klein said. "It does." The word hung there. Accountability. The thing everyone wanted until it required sacrifice. "What exactly are you proposing?" Legal asked. Klein looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up. "Immediate termination of the gate supervisor. Termination of the regional manager who suppressed the complaints. Suspension pending review of all staff present during the incident. Revocation of loyalty privileges for the passenger who initiated the request. And a full audit of discretionary authority across domestic routes." The room exhaled as one. "That's extensive," Operations said. "It's proportional," Klein replied. "And if it leaks?" Communications pressed. Klein met her gaze. "It already has. We just haven't admitted it yet." Keene's tablet buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked up. "Press is circling. They've noticed the staffing changes." Klein nodded. "Then we don't wait." At the hotel, Marcus and Renee sat in separate silence, each in their own thoughts. The television was off. The city noise filtered in through the window like static. Marcus's phone rested on the table between them, face down. Renee broke the quiet. "If they do this," she said slowly, "people will blame us." Marcus didn't look up. "People already do." "I mean, really blame us," she said. "For lost jobs, for overreaction, for escalation." He finally met her eyes. "Do you want to be liked, or do you want it to stop?" She flinched, then nodded. "I want it to stop." "That's the price," he said. The phone buzzed. Marcus turned it over. Decision made. Announcement in 90 minutes. Renee felt her chest tighten. "That's fast." "That's fear," Marcus replied. Back at headquarters, Human Resources drafted termination letters with language so precise it bordered on cruel. Not because they wanted to be, because they had learned that vagueness invited lawsuits. Ev Brooks received the email while sitting at his kitchen table, coffee gone cold. Subject line, Employment Status Update. He didn't open it at first. He stared at it as if it might change. When he finally did, he read it twice, then a third time. Terminated. Effective immediately. Violation of company policy. Pattern of conduct. No appeal. His phone buzzed again. A text from a former colleague. "Did you see this coming?" Evan didn't answer. He thought of the twins, of the way they had stood there, unmoving. He thought of how sure he had been, how routine it had felt. He stood and paced, then stopped, sat back down. The room felt smaller now. The authority he had worn for years evaporated without ceremony. Across town, Lila Grant sat on her couch, phone in her lap, watching the news crawl begin to scroll. No names yet, just language. Airline investigates discriminatory incident. Staff placed on leave. Her phone rang. HR again. "We've concluded the initial review," the representative said. "You'll be suspended for 30 days, pending retraining and reassignment." Lila closed her eyes. Relief and shame collided in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure what she was thanking them for. "You will be required to participate in mandatory reporting training," the voice continued, "and to provide testimony if requested." "I will," Lila said immediately. "I want to." At the same time, William Crowley sat in his office, staring at an email that felt unreal. Preferred status revoked. Access privileges suspended. Conduct under review. He reread it, then laughed aloud. Sharp, disbelieving. He forwarded it to 3 contacts. No replies. For the first time, he felt what it was like to press against a system and find no give. At the hotel, Marcus's phone rang again. This time it was David Klein. "It's done," Klein said, no preamble. Marcus closed his eyes. Renee watched him, breath held. "We're issuing a statement," Klein continued. "We're naming the failure, not the passengers, the system." Marcus said nothing. "You should know," Klein added, "this will cost us." "It already has," Marcus replied. Klein exhaled. "I don't expect your approval, but I wanted you to hear it from me." Renee leaned toward the phone. "We didn't want people punished," she said. "We wanted the behavior to end." Klein paused. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "those are the same thing." The call ended. Marcus set the phone down gently, as if it might break. Renee sat back. "So this is what it looks like." "Yes," he said. "This is what it costs." Outside, the city kept moving. Inside the company, careers were ending. Policies were being rewritten.
and conversations long avoided were finally being had under fluorescent lights. The system had been forced to look at itself, and it did not like what it saw. By the time the announcement went live, the language had been stripped of every unnecessary word. No names.
No dramatics, just facts arranged like evidence. An internal failure, a violation of policy, immediate corrective action, a commitment to oversight that would be measured, audited, enforced. Inside the company, people read it twice, some 3 times. Not because it was confusing, because it was unmistakable. At a regional office outside Columbus, managers gathered in small clusters, voices low. The kind of conversations that start with, "Did you see this?" and end with, "Who's next?" Laptops stayed open. Emails went unanswered. People who had once relied on familiarity suddenly realized familiarity cut both ways. Evan Brooks sat alone in his apartment, the termination email still open on his screen. He had called 2 people. One didn't answer. The other said they were sorry and meant something else entirely. He stared at the words "pattern of conduct" until they blurred. Pattern. As if it had all been visible long before yesterday. As if the company had simply waited for proof it could not ignore. He thought of the gate, of how ordinary it had felt, how justified, how easy. The shock wasn't that he'd been fired. It was that the system he had trusted to protect him had turned without hesitation once the math changed. Across town, Lila Grant sat at her kitchen table, training materials open on her laptop, untouched. She hadn't been told when she would return to work, only that she might, only that her silence had been noted, weighed, measured. She replayed the moment again, the whisper to Evan, the shake of his head, the choice to stay still. She had thought stillness was safety. She understood now that it was just delay. At the hotel, Marcus and Renee watched the news coverage roll in quietly. The story had legs now. Not sensational, not viral, but persistent. A slow burn that refused to die in a single cycle. Commentators spoke about corporate accountability, about discretionary power, about what it meant when ordinary interactions revealed extraordinary bias. Renee muted the television. "They're talking around it," she said. "They always do," Marcus replied, "until they can't." Her phone buzzed. A message from a colleague. "Proud of you." Another from an old friend. "This is bigger than you think." A third, anonymous. "You cost people their jobs." She stared at that one longer than the rest. Marcus saw her expression. "You didn't." She looked up. "I know that, but knowing doesn't make it lighter." He nodded. "No, it just makes it accurate." In a glass-walled office, David Klein stood alone, jacket back on, tie loosened. The board meeting had ended without applause, without congratulations. He preferred it that way. Applause suggested closure. This wasn't closed. Legal fallout was already being mapped, investor calls scheduled, talking points refined. He had signed off on decisions that would cost millions and save something harder to quantify. Trust, maybe, or the illusion of it. He looked out over the city and thought of the call, of Marcus's voice, calm, unyielding, not asking, informing. The kind of voice that didn't beg systems to change. It forced them to confront themselves. His assistant knocked lightly. "We're getting questions about precedent." Klein turned. "Tell them precedent already existed. We're just acknowledging it." She hesitated. "And the passengers?" Klein's mouth tightened. "They're not to be contacted again. No follow-ups, no gestures. We don't turn people into mascots." The assistant nodded and left. Back at the airport, gate C-19 reopened. New staff, new supervisor, same floor, same lights, different posture. The briefings were longer now,
the language sharper, the warning explicit. Discretion is not permission. Some employees rolled their eyes in private. Others listened carefully. The difference mattered. William Crowley sat in his study, the loyalty card cut cleanly in half on his desk.
He hadn't expected that part. The revocation. The finality. He drafted a letter to the airline president, then stopped. He had already sent too many messages that no one answered. For the first time in decades, he wondered if the system had never been on his side, if it had simply never been forced to choose. Renee stood at the window again that night, city lights blinking like distant signals. "Do you think it changes anything?" she asked. Marcus joined her. "It changes something. That's not the same." "No," he agreed. "But it's closer than nothing." She leaned her forehead against the glass. "I don't feel victorious." He shook his head. "You're not supposed to." They stood there in silence, listening to the hum of traffic below. Somewhere, people were having dinners, watching games, arguing about politics. Life continued, indifferent to the fact that a line had been crossed and redrawn. Marcus's phone buzzed again. Not from Klein, not from compliance. A different number, he answered cautiously. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. Female. Steady. "My name is Karen Liu. I work in risk analysis for a transportation oversight committee." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "I'm calling because your case has raised questions," Liu continued. "Questions that don't end with one airline." Renee watched his face change. Not fear. Recognition again. The story expanding beyond its original frame. "We'd like to speak with you," Liu said. "Not as plaintiffs. As witnesses." Marcus looked at Renee. She nodded once. "Okay," he said. "We'll talk." After the call ended, Renee exhaled slowly. "So it keeps going." "Yes," Marcus said. "That's how systems learn, when the pressure doesn't stop." She smiled faintly, not from joy, from resolve. Somewhere inside the company, training sessions began. Not because everyone believed, because belief was no longer required. Compliance was. Somewhere else, a junior employee watched a supervisor hesitate before making a call they once would have made without thought. That hesitation mattered more than any memo. The story wasn't over. It wouldn't wrap itself neatly. It wouldn't offer catharsis on demand. But it had done something rare. It had left a mark that could not be smoothed away. And for the first time since Gate C-19, Marcus allowed himself to sit down, close his eyes, and breathe. Not because it was finished, because it was finally moving in the right direction. The hearing room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and consequences rippled outward, long after the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed. Marcus Brooks sat at the long oak table, with his hands folded, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Renee sat beside him, calm on the surface, every muscle tight beneath her coat. Across from them, a row of officials reviewed documents they already knew by heart. No cameras, no audience, just records, patterns, and the slow machinery of accountability finally turning. David Klein entered last. He didn't look at Marcus right away. He set his briefcase down carefully, as if sudden movements might fracture something already fragile. When he did meet Marcus's eyes, there was no hostility there, only recognition, and a restraint that came from knowing the moment no longer belonged to him. This was not a negotiation. It was an accounting. The chair of the committee spoke in a voice that carried the weight of years. Findings had been reviewed, internal communications examined, prior complaints compared across regions. The words systematic failure appeared more than once. So did preventable.
Marcus listened without reacting. He had learned that the loudest moments were rarely the most important ones. The important ones were like this: controlled, documented, impossible to spin. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He described the gait, the tone, the casual certainty with which authority had been misused. He described how quickly dignity could be questioned when no one expected resistance. He spoke about silence, too, how it functioned like permission, how systems relied on it more than rules. Renee spoke next. She talked about aftermath, about the emails that never came, about the messages that did, about how accountability felt different when you were inside it instead of demanding it from the outside. Her voice never wavered, but her hands tightened once, just enough for Marcus to notice. The committee thanked them, not warmly, precisely. The kind of thanks that acknowledged impact rather than emotion. Outside, the air was sharp and clear. Renee exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. "That's it," she said softly. "That's this part," Marcus replied. They walked together down the steps. Neither rushed. Neither looked back. 3 weeks later, the report went public. It wasn't explosive. It didn't trend with outrage-driven headlines. It was thorough, dry, devastating. Numbers replaced anecdotes. Patterns replaced excuses. Recommendations came with timelines, oversight, penalties that carried teeth instead of apologies. Airlines across the industry issued statements that all sounded similar. Commitments, reviews, renewed values. Some meant it, some didn't. That difference would show soon enough. Skybridge Airways moved fast, not because it wanted redemption, but because delay now carried cost. Training protocols were rewritten, authority at gates narrowed, escalation procedures clarified, whistleblower protections expanded beyond legal minimums. Some employees welcomed the changes, others resented them. Culture, Marcus knew, always resisted before it adapted. Lila Grant returned to work on a probationary status that felt heavier than termination might have. She moved differently now, watched differently. When a supervisor spoke too quickly, she asked for clarification. When a passenger was questioned without cause, she intervened, voice steady, hands visible. It wasn't heroism. It was correction. Slow, uncomfortable, necessary. Evan Brooks did not return. He appealed once, formally. It failed. He found work elsewhere, quieter, smaller. The pattern followed him, not as punishment, but as fact. Systems remembered when people forgot. William Crowley watched from a distance as his name faded from loyalty lists and lounges. He flew less, complained more. The world had not collapsed around him. It had simply stopped bending. For Marcus and Renee, life recalibrated. Speaking invitations came and went. They accepted some, declined others. They refused to become symbols that could be flattened into slogans. Instead, they focused on process, on telling the story as it was. Uneven, unresolved, real. On a fall morning, they boarded a different flight, different airline, same class of seat. The agent scanned their passes without pause. No extra glance, no commentary, just procedure. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tight. At cruising altitude, Renee leaned back and closed her eyes. "This is how it should feel," she said. "Unremarkable." "That's the goal," Marcus replied. Months passed. News cycles moved on. But in meeting rooms and training modules, the case was still referenced. Not by name, by scenario. The quiet example that made people stop before making the easy choice. One evening, Marcus stood at the window of their apartment, city lights stretching out like a grid of possibilities.
He thought about the call that had started everything. How small it had felt at the time. How ordinary. Change, he realized, rarely announced itself. It arrived disguised as inconvenience, as resistance, as the moment you chose not to look away. Renee joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He thought of the weight, the scrutiny, the cost, then of the silence they'd refused. "No," he said. "I respect it." She smiled, just slightly. Somewhere, a new employee finished a training module and paused at a case study that sounded familiar. Somewhere else, a supervisor reconsidered a decision that would once have gone unquestioned. These moments would never be celebrated. They didn't need to be. Marcus turned from the window. Tomorrow, they would wake up and go to work. Ordinary work. The kind that built lives instead of headlines. The story would remain larger than them, as it should. If this journey resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with 3 words. Speak up, always.